Fantasy has many definitions and variations, but undoubtedly something that sets it apart from other genres is the setting that it takes place in. When you have a fantasy story, it often takes place in a fantastical setting of some kind. You know, there's people that love having a map at the front of the book, and there's idiots. But whichever one you are, you may be in the hunt for a new setting for your next D&D campaign, and I would like to help with that. But before we jump into some good settings, let's talk about what makes a setting good, just so that I can explain why I've made these choices. A setting is almost never the main focus of a story. It is by nature the background. It's the canvas upon which you and your characters are going to paint the story. That said, different canvases, different settings are built for different stories. You don't have to ignore the setting. You should not ignore the setting, because the setting will affect the story. It's not the main focus of the story, or, you know, not exactly the main focus of the story, but it informs the story, and the story that you want to tell is also going to inform your setting. If you're trying to do a dungeon crawl and you set it in a broad open world, it's going to be a lot harder to tie things into the dungeon crawl than if you set it in a sort of grimdark dungeony world. If you're telling a story that takes place in an urban setting, you have to have a city that is diverse and large enough to accommodate all of the twists and turns that you want to have in the story. All I'm trying to say is that don't just pick a setting because you like the setting, pick the setting that's right for the story. Also, because we're playing D&D, there's a lot of naturally fantastical elements that have nothing to do with the setting, and you need to be aware of how those things, dragons, spells, dungeons, interact with the world. Are people on board with magic? Is this commonplace? Is this swords and sorcery? Is this something that's emerging? Are these things beginning to happen in the world and so everyone's learning at the same time as your characters? Are these things that have never happened before? Is this all brand new to everyone? Has the world been shaped by magic? Are dragons a force in the world? You know, are these monsters commonplace? How does it make sense? Does it make sense, or are we going to see how it makes sense as the story progresses? All you need to do is figure out how magic, because that's the kind of the key thing, interacts with your world. This is a little bit abstract. When I get into the examples of the settings, we're going to see how this all plays out. Finally, keep in mind that these suggestions are not replacements. They're something that should inspire. With a couple of important twists, you can turn them into perfect settings for your story, but you basically don't plagiarize. There's not a lot of fun in that. In some cases you can. Elements you can plagiarize, especially because you're probably playing a home D&D game, which you can kind of take whatever you want. But it's going to be more fun if you do small tweaks to customize these suggestions to fit your story. All right, let's talk specifics. Suggestion 1, Europe. It's not a real place. This was originally going to be Westeros, because Westeros is a really good example of nuanced, culturally different sections of a relatively small setting that can obviously butt heads a lot and get along to a certain degree, and it creates for a very cohesive open world style map. But then I was like, well, in many ways Westeros is inspired by Middle-earth. You know, they play on the same sort of classic high fantasy themes. And also, is it fair to say Westeros when I could instead choose Middle-earth? So I was like, well, we should probably use Middle-earth as our initial example. It's so iconic. And then I was like, both of those places are actually just the same place. It's Europe. RR number 1 just made the Shire, England, on the mainland, and then, you know, put the trenches of World War I over in the Mordor area, and then that was, you know, that was kind of it. RR number 2 was even sort of, I mean, the whole series is inspired by the War of the Roses, but he just did one of these, like, things with Britain. So you can do that too. Also, you know, Europe is indicative of the fact that a lot of real-world places work great as fantasy maps. The real world has a lot of cultural diversity and topological diversity. Topographical. I'm gonna check what topological means. But that's what you need in sort of a large, if you're playing an open world from place to place, places differ, big cities, small cities, towns, languages change. The real world is a perfect place to draw inspiration from, because that is how it is. I don't think I need to go too much into it. If you're playing a long campaign where you want your players to travel a lot and they want to see a lot of different things, people, places, the real world is a perfect inspiration. Choose your spot, take a slice out of the globe, have fun with it. Option 2, Discworld. Now, Discworld is similar-ish to the first suggestion in that it is a large open world which with a great amount of variety. The difference is that the Discworld from Terry Pratchett's Discworld series is inherently magical. Everything about it has magic basically incorporated into it, or it has been affected by magic. For those who are unaware of Discworld, it is a flat plane carried on the back of 4 elephants who ride on the Great Turtle Atween as they ride through the void. Now, Already you can probably tell this is a relatively aggressive fantasy setting in the sense that a lot of stuff is fantastical. But this works really well for a lot of D&D campaigns in the sense of a lot of people are slinging spells. There's a lot of creatures crawling out of back alleys that you might need a way to explain, and you can explain it by them just being part of the world already and everyone accepting the fact that this is a chaotic, naturally, magically imbued world. That works great in a world like Discworld. So if you're playing a similar style of game to the first option, but you're doing so with a greater emphasis on the impact of magic, or the way that magic is woven into the world, you can look more to Discworld as an inspiration than the real world or Middle-earth or Westeros. Okay, now on to some more thematically strong ones. Some less classic sword and sorcery and some really fun story setting combinations. Number 3 is Mega City 1. This comes from the Dread comics, and this is essentially a massive urban setting. In the comics, it takes up the majority of the eastern seaboard in North America, all as a single city, and it is run by the Justice Department, which is a dictatorial department that decides all of the rules and how they're enforced. The city itself is split up into different blocks, different neighborhoods, which are essentially different cities, but there's no break of landscape between them. It's just city to city, and then you'll see the differences between neighborhoods, the diversity. So you can get that same feeling of a bunch of different people, a bunch of different places, without having to ever leave an urban setting. So if you're running an urban setting, you can use Mega City 1 as inspiration because it's a massive city and there are some strong thematic elements like the judges, which are basically the hand of the Justice Department. They decide who lives, who dies, who broke the law, who is going to suffer the consequences for doing so. And so you can have your players be a group of judges, or people who are trying to rebel against the judges, or someone that doesn't have anything to do with rebelling or being judges at all, and just aware of the fact that this is a megalopolis with the hand of the dictatorial governmental department running it, and that you have to be very aware of them when they're coming or going, or when they can be bribed and when they can't be bribed. It's a strong thematic element within this urban setting that you can use as inspiration for your setting. Number 4, Arrakis, Dune. This is a iconic setting that you can use pretty easily in D&D because it is a very fantasy setting already. It's sci-fi, space opera, fantasy setting already. It doesn't have to be a desert world, but Dune is a great example of a world or a setting that is extremely strongly thematically themed. It's a desert. You can use an entire forest planet, you can use an entire water planet, you can use basically whatever you can think of. But the idea being that the whole theme is cohesive, and also this is an example of a story having a lot to do with the setting, because obviously everyone on Arrakis is trying to handle the spice. They're trying to take control of the spice. It's the only place in the universe you can get it. The galaxy, sorry. So you have to consider, if you're going to do a singular themed setting, why everyone is there. And if it's just sort of the backdrop, you're going to be limited by the fact that everything is, if you picture going to Dune for a D&D campaign, but the D&D party, the story has nothing to do with the spice, well, why are they here, right? The whole power structure is there because of the spice. So if you're going to set up a setting similar to this, you have to consider why people are there, not only right now, but also going back. What is the reason that people settled here in the first place, and how does that affect the story? Are we trying to gain control of it? Are we trying to dismantle it? Whatever that power structure is and whatever it is built upon is going to affect the story. It might be important to the story, it might be a side thing in the story, but it's going to affect it. And you can really highlight that story point by crafting your setting around it. Also, some things that Dune does really well are the natural hazards. I mean, living out in the desert is very difficult. That's well established. That is something that is fun as a player to figure out. If you're going to be cast out into a naturally hazardous environment, that's a fun part of problem solving as a D&D party. And it still has multiple societies, right? There's those who live out in the desert and those who live in cities. And again, regardless of if it's an actual desert world, you can still create a bit of diversity within your world, even if it is singularly thematically themed. So just be aware that just because everything is built around a single theme in a setting doesn't mean that it has to be uniform. For Arrakis, I would also recommend, it's a compelling story and the elements can be mapped quite easily. Some version of space cocaine is a great plot point, and also having massive worms, which are already stat block in D&D, just sort of roaming around your world, that's real fun. I'd highly recommend that. I'm not going to number this one, I'm going to be very brief about it, but there is also a setting that I need to mention called Oromais, which is a part of Gilman's Guide to Speed, which is the book that I wrote. It's a D&D 5th edition source book that we funded on Kickstarter. It is fully out and released now, so if you'd like a fully built out setting along with a bunch of new classes, subclasses, spells, magic items, and mechanics for how to run a race, go check out Gilman's Guide to Speed. And number 5, this is our last one. We're taking a bit of a deeper cut here, but I think modern D&D, we're playing less and less of a classic dungeon crawler, but it is very much still an important part of the game. That can be an important part of the game. A lot of people like crawling dungeons. And a setting that works really well for that is the first house from the Gideon the Ninth book. Gideon the Ninth is the first book in the Locked Tomb series. I've only read Gideon the Ninth, so no spoilers, and also I'm not totally sure where this goes. But the first book is fantastic, and the setting that is used for it is excellent. Essentially, the first house is a massive mansion. It's a castle built eons ago that is now falling into disrepair. It's a blending of unknowable technologies and magics that have then gotten lost, and so our characters are trying to figure out what's up, what's going on here, which works great as a dungeon crawler because your party can be seeking something within the first house and trying to figure out how to open locked doors, how to get deeper into the house, into the basements and the sub-basements, how to get up near the top, how do you get into the attics, what can you see from the top. The first house has a lot of locked doors and a lot of unlocked doors. You can find clues and hints a lot easier behind unlocked doors, but ultimately you know you're either going to need the keys or the tools to unlock the locked doors, because that's obviously where the greatest secrets lie. And that very tactile setting sets up the mystery and the desire of the party, which is what's behind these locked doors. Oh, there's a bunch of doors you can go into. They're unlocked. That's great. This is a crazy crumbling neolith that we are existing within. And you can explore all of it, except for behind the locked doors. I mean, come on, who's not going to want to unlock those doors? It also works well because there's essentially like a welcome atrium and everyone gets their own bedroom, and all of that is seen as sort of safe and normal. It's kind of like a return to the main menu area. So you can have your party be crawling this dungeon, and then when you need a reason for them to be able to safely long rest, you can just say, well, you can just return back up to the atrium and you know, if you want to impose a danger before they get there, that works out easily because, again, this is a mysterious, massive castle. You can impose a monster, an enemy, a door that's disappeared very easily in a mysterious place. But if you want them to be able to long rest safely, you can allow them to do so. And it makes sense thematically in the setting that you've built. So there you have it, 5 very thematically strong settings that you can use for D&D in a variety of different stories. Keep in mind what you're doing, how you're going to alter them, how it feeds your story, and vice versa. And also keep in mind if your players want to play in a world like this, that, or the other. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and remember, if it's 1 or in 20, the important thing is to keep on rolling.